to Counter Charge. I'm Rob Enough.
And I'm Matt Croger. Welcome, and when I thought we'd do a little video with the hobby master, Rob Phaneuf, on how to care for your brushes, what brushes he uses when he's doing his hobby wizardry. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of that video, why don't we catch up on what we've been doing, Rob? What's been happening in Phaneuf Hobbyland?
A lot of cleaning lately. Really having to sort through stuff. You get to the point where you start buying stuff that you can't find, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was trying to hang on. Hey guys, can you quiet? I'm on a podcast. Thank you. We'll see how that goes over. It's probably gonna throw something at me. Yeah, so I've been cleaning a lot, especially upstairs. It was a disaster up here. And it's still not 100%. And I had to put, it's getting hot now. It's 86 degrees, 100% humidity, not 80% humidity, something like that. So I had to put the air conditioning in because I have air in the house, but like upstairs, it's like the end of the chain. So yeah. So I had a lot of cleaning to do, but paint station is all cleaned. It's all reworked. It's good to go. Wet palettes are all reconfigured and ready to rock. And I'm painting Champions, which has been fun.
You played much Champions?
Yeah, I played, I don't know, 2 dozen games, somewhere in there. So I'm playing Basilean every time because that's what I'm building. And I haven't played against as many armies as I would like. I played a lot against Abyssals and Twilightkin. And then I think 1 or 2 games against Night Stalkers. So I'm waiting for other people to build like the Northern Alliance and the Goblins. So we're hoping to start a slow grow league locally here in the really near future. So hopefully I'll get a chance to play other companies. And what I found is there are some companies that are like almost like a rock, paper, scissors. Like there's some like the Basilean. I have a pretty good winning record against the Abyssals. If the Abyssal player isn't aggressive, if they stand back, it's over because the Abyssal company has higher nerve and has Iron Resolve and some other things that kind of yeah. So it's been fun. How about you? You've been playing it all?
No, I've got my all-in set finally. Came in, and so I've got to start building it. I've been working on my my larger Abyssal army. So I've almost finished painting 2 hordes of lower Abyssals, and I've been working on the bases. So I got 2 hordes. One I'm building is 2 regiments. So we've got this camera's the worst camera. There we go. You can see that as the base when it comes into focus every now and then.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, so it's a mushroom. Is that right?
It's so it's a bit of a mushroom fungal kind of forest, meant to be bleached of a lot of color with a bit of teal because there's teal on the models. So that came in there. I mean, this is the it's only got the base coating on it. Let's get that in.
Looks good though. I like it.
Yeah,
it's a nice muted color like palette or a backdrop for an army that'll probably have a little bit more color, right?
It'll have a little bit more. It won't stand out so much on the lower Abyssals, but you can see that starting with a dark blue there, coming into teal weapons with a little bit of red and things. So, I always like to provide the contrast between base and models, so the kind of models pop out of the base a little bit more. So, that's what I've been working on. So you're finding the Champions repeatable enough, obviously.
Yeah, it's been fun. Well, there's 6 different scenarios. And we're finding that the scenarios, like maybe my army, my company, Basilean is a little bit better, maybe in certain scenarios. Like for example, I find when I spread out too much, which there are some scenarios that want you to do that, like I get in trouble. I've got to keep things together because I got to counterpunch and that kind of thing. So also like one of my commands is to give a unit +2 unit strength. If you're playing if there's many of the scenarios, it doesn't even matter what your unit strength is, right? Because in this game, to hold an objective, you just have to have unit strength there, and your opponent can't, right? Like it's really easy to contest, which I understand why, because you only have 4 units. It's been fun though.
And have you been able to see whether it's how they're doing commands or some of the tweaks to the rules? Have you seen that being like some of those being good as probably things that might carry into 4th?
I would think the commands is the way they should do it. Don't have the dice, just give me the commands and have them tied to a unit. I mean, maybe there's some different restrictions they could also add for Kings of War, like keywords and stuff. But yeah, I like the fact that you're not rolling a resource. And I also think it's cool that at the beginning of the turn, there's the champions phase, right? Where you both players place your things. Really cool. I also really enjoy you could hold one of your commands back and not deploy it on a unit. And then if you're in combat and the unit that you've engaged is not inspired, you can then reroll one of your dice for the nerve test, which is really powerful. Which again goes back to why you don't want to spread out, because if you're out of inspiring range, I am totally going to take that, and I'm going to I rolled a 6, well I'm going to roll that 1. Let's see what happens.
I think for me the thing that seems much more elegant is that the way they brought command dice into Kings of War is it almost put the choices on, it made the player the general even more and didn't necessarily increase the relevance of the individual models a lot. Right. Whereas in Firefight, that's different. Like in certain situations for certain commands, you need it within a certain range, right? Mm-hmm. And I think making the model itself relevant actually fits really well with Kings because it's a movement game. Yep. And so, no longer is it just, I have to have it within 6 inches so things are inspiring, making it more relevant in other ways, I think is a really good idea.
Exactly. Yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun. I've also started building an elf fleet for Armada, which I'm a glutton for punishment because it feels like it's not a great fleet. I mean, let me back up. It's super fast. But in a lot of the games that I've seen played with elves, it's like they're fast, but they don't take a punch at all. And so you usually
resilience.
Yeah, the resiliency isn't there. But I'm going to give it a go. I mean, I have the models and I've got them all assembled, and I'm getting ready to clean them up and I'll paint them up. So
yeah, I mean, it's been a long time since I played Armada, but my last time I did, it felt like resilience is a big thing in the game. That if your ships just last, you'll win.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things there. I think number one, you're right. I think the more locally at least, people have devolved into, you play with one big extra large or large ship and then a few ships to support it, because that extra large ship or even just a really big large ship is really hard to kill. I mean, they're very resilient to the point where why even bother trying to kill them? Now, flip side though, they've also added some things like ghost fleets and stuff, completely not balanced at all. And so we're going to be playing a league locally, and then we're going to basically play with the normal fleets, like no ghost fleet, because it is. I mean, it gets back to what it's not Mantic, right? Mantic typically doesn't have a game where your opponent can make you stop using your army in the way it wants to stop being used. Like, so example, ghost fleet, like you can't ram them. Well, like there's certain fleets, that's their whole bag, is that we're gonna hit you, right? There's other fleets that want to shoot you and drop lots of criticals. Well, you don't get critical hits against the ghost fleet. So I understand why they did it. They did it to it's flavorful, I guess is the best way to say it. It's cool, but like in a competitive setting, it's the same thing we've said about our ambush, right? If you play ambush competitively, it kind of breaks down unless you have people that are willing to put the training wheels on and self-restraint. Self-restraint's a big thing, and not everybody can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Ghost Fleet, it's one of those fantasy tropes almost, isn't it? So I think it's good to have that option.
And they have the fleet available on the Vault now, so I mean, it's great, right? If you're an Armada enthusiast, I mean, the Vault is where it's at, man. You've got Forces of the Abyss, Kingdoms of Men, fleets that are only available for 3D printing, and you got other things like ghost fleets and stuff. So, and every other fleet too, right? That's available.
Yeah. I just need half a day to put into my resin printer at the moment. It's just one portion isn't printing well, and it keeps buggering it up, and I need to figure out why.
I don't bother. I just let my store prints. The other thing for people that if they're interested in Armada, I highly recommend just get a fleet that doesn't have sails. If you're really worried about the hobby, because it is a pain. So
there's a bunch of them, right? There's dwarves. I think. Do the salamanders have sails?
Yeah, but but like Empire Dust has ships that are like the sails are a little more chunky. The elves are. I mean, the big boat has like 4 sails. Right. So I'm like, oh my gosh. And typically, I am having to pin them to really give them a little bit of
Yeah.
extra strength. So because I'm gonna pin them, pull them apart for painting, and then it'll make gluing it together when it's all done easier if there's a pin there.
Yeah.
But like Abyssal Dwarves and Dwarves, no sales at all,
Yeah.
and really great. And to be fair, both of those sleeves are very dependable and very resilient, as we were talking about before.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, let's slide into what we're here for, and this is for us all to learn from Hobby Master Rob, about how to what you use for your hobby, but also how best to care for it. I think. I mean, I certainly know I'm a very sloppy hobbyist, and
yes, you
so
are, but I wouldn't say that to your face.
No. Probably just sloppy in general, to be honest. I'm a sloppy
Well,
kind of guy.
you're not a sloppy dresser. Let's just say that.
Oh, thanks, mate. Thank you.
You're a very, very proper dresser. But
thank you. Yeah.
Your hobby,
you can't see under the table right now.
That's true. You could have just a jock strap on or something.
So why don't we start with the brushes themselves? And there's lots of different painting styles, I guess, as well as different painting techniques. And I think it's interesting to think about that. So like techniques, you might have people who enjoy layering, others enjoy wet blending or doing a layer then a dry brush. Some like using washes, some don't, some like using glazes. And then of course you've got your different paints like water-based, oil-based washes, speed paints, various additives, flow improver, drying retarder, airbrush. Do you tend to change it up based on, I mean, first of all, what's your current favorite style and what have you done over the years? And do you tend to change up your brushes depending on the technique that you're doing?
Yeah, I think ultimately you look at the model and you know what you want to do with it, like in terms of maybe a color or the scheme, and maybe the type of paint you want to use. That will dictate what tools you use, right? So you go through the techniques like layering. So layering is what it sounds like, which most people, when they say they're painting a miniature, they're layering. So you put a base color on, you add a mid-tone, right? I should preface this. The traditional way that you layer is you paint your mid-tone, you shade it down, right? And then you go back to the mid-tone and then go up to the highlight. That's a lot more steps than I like to do. So I typically paint dark to light. So I'll just paint dark, mid-tone, highlight. And it's sort of like a topographical map in the sense that I will add the highlights, especially if these are tabletop level, right? You're just going to paint, the highlights are going to be brighter and smaller areas, right? Like the raised areas and stuff. And for that, you were asking like what you're typically going to use a round brush, right? So, so here's two round brushes, right? So this one, and we'll talk a little bit about what these are, but this is a Klinsky Sable Windsor Newton Series 7. And this is a number 3. And then this is a number 2 round synthetic brush from a company called Escato that I've been using to good effect. So when you're layering, you're typically going to be using a round brush, and what we could talk when we get to brushes, we can maybe talk about the difference between paying a lot for a brush that's a higher quality brush versus buying an inexpensive brush. There's pros and cons to that. In your case, it's a waste to buy an expensive brush, right? Like if you're not going to take care of it, you're going to be throwing money down the sink, right? But the other technique that you mentioned is called wet blending, right? And so layering is I have a color and I add a new, like a lighter color and a lighter color and a lighter color, and that's what I do. Wet blending, you take two colors while they're wet and you blend them, right? And you certainly can do that with acrylics. Usually you'll be like, there's a popular technique by Matt DiPietro, who was back at War Machine like a million years ago, where it's called two brush blending, which is pretty popular. If I'm going to wet blend, which does give you really amazing gradation, I'll typically try. I've sort of slowly moved over to oil paints because oil paints don't dry very long. It takes a long time to dry, and you have a lot of working time with them. And then, but again, both wet blending and layering, and most painting, period, you're just going to use a round brush, right?
And is there any different? And you don't have to like oil paints. you don't need a different type of brush
No,
to
it's the same
help it
brush,
going.
but the reality is you know, cleaning them and taking care of them is the difference, right?
Mm.
Because you're going to need different solvents to clean acrylic paint versus oil-based paint. Then the other technique you've got on the list here is dry brushing, and traditionally, you know, you could dry brush with one of these, right? You basically put the paint on and you kind of use the side of the brush, but you know that is really, really, really rough on a brush. Like really rough on a brush. And if you have a really small area, maybe it's fine. But if you're doing like fur or something, you know, back in the 90s, we would probably say, hey, use a big flat brush, right? And, you know, you put the paint on and then you basically just do it the right way. Here we go. You just sort of scrape, you know, rub it across the surface. And the goal is to deposit paint on the high points of the texture, right? And the amount of paint you use and the amount of pressure that you apply will dictate how much paint is deposited, right? In fact, there's a technique called overbrushing, or that's what I call it, where the brush is more wet and you can do the same thing, the same method, but you'll apply a lot more paint. But you know, this is maybe what I would have used exclusively like 10 years ago. Now, most people are moving to what I call the makeup style brush, and you certainly can buy makeup style brushes. Army Painter makes some. And we'll talk about my actual brushes, but these are from Monument Hobbies. And again,
I've been using something similar these days. But again, you know, I tend to buy those ones a bit dirt cheap and just
for sure. Well, any tool that you use that if you don't know how you're going to use it, like if you don't know how to use it, how to take care of it, like you don't build up to spending money on a good brush. And then a couple other, they're not really techniques, but they're sort of, well, they are sort of techniques, but washes and glazes, right? So like a wash would be something, you know, again, you would apply it with, you know, a regular round brush, and, you know, a wash, you apply it over a surface. It's going to wash the surface. It's going to flow into the dark crevices, the deeper crevices, as opposed to, you know, a glaze, which is really more of like a tint or a film that you're putting over the whole surface. And so like this is bloodletter red glaze. So it would give the whole surface a red look. Whereas this is Seraphim sepia. So like you put this over gold and it darkens the crevices, right? Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think probably one thing to qualify is obviously with Kings of War, multi-basing is a thing. So, you know, I tend to, if I'm using proper washes or something on a base or whatever, or painting that, I'm not going to use my good brushes on that. You know, if you've got like, better brushes, and you know,
so this
you
is
probably
good,
don't have
like,
to be as picky either.
Good example, right? So this is a Raphael 8404 Kolinsky Sable. It's like $22, so it is not a cheap brush. But this one, let me back up a little bit. This one is pretty wore out. So now this is a wash brush for me. Like the tip is pretty well gone. So that's typically, you know, again, most of the time you're going to use a round brush, really, unless you're doing something special like dry brushing.
Yeah,
that might be, you know, and I say that like there are other things like, you know, we talked a lot about oil painting, right? Like on the Blue City Brawl update, and in that one you're not just using brushes, you're using like makeup sponges and stuff. So there's other ways to manipulate paint on a model. And with that, maybe we can jump into paint, right? Because I mean, most people when they think of paint, you know, you could think of craft paint or you could think of artist paint, like in the big, you know, the Liquitex, the big tubes. But most people will think of, you know, hobby paint. Like this is a bottle of Reaper, right? 17 milliliter pot with a dropper tip, or more popular right now, which I still hate the bottle, is this Monument Hobbies, you know, Pro Acryl paint. Those are acrylic, right? So acrylic paint, you're gonna put it on, it's gonna dry. Preferably, you don't let it sit on the brush and ruin the brush. You try to keep it off clean. You know, oil paint again is different in the sense that you could have it on the brush for a long time, but it's not drying for a very long time. So you have a lot more working time, and you also have a lot of time to clean the brush out. And then, like I mentioned, we have washes, right? Well, we talked about washes and glazes, but then there's also, I don't have one in front of me, but you know, contrast paints, speed paints, those kind of things are real popular too.
So this is like a speed paint.
Yep. That's the
version 2
Fanatics
there.
range,
That's
or is that
a
no, that's
speed
actually just
paint.
their speed paint, right? Not their
Yeah,
Fanatics
yeah,
range.
yeah. So that's Pallid Bone. That's an example. It's very runny. It comes in a bottle. But their Fanatics look pretty much the
Yeah.
same.
So
So I'm using Fanatics for highlighting up.
yeah. And most people, we're gonna get to like wet palettes and stuff, but most people are using water to dilute their
Mm.
paint, right?
Yeah.
But there are additives that you can use. So one of them is like some would call it there's like flow improver, like something, like something out of Liquitex. Now this is actually retarder, which actually isn't flow. So flow improver thins the paint, but does a pretty good job of not changing the color, right? Like diluting the color very much. It just makes it thinner. Whereas retarder, or also known as slow dry retarder, those are just going to slow down how the drying time. They're going to slow down the drying time. So that it
And do
takes.
you
So you
find
have
it
more.
changes the quality of the paint though, or is it
Yeah, if you
except for the drying time?
yeah, I mean, I don't use it very much because it does feel like it's a little more tacky, and it does to me change the consistency enough that well, number one is I don't need it because most of the time if I am layering, you have very thin layers and you need to put the layer on like within like 10 seconds, it's already dry. Right. I'm typically layering, right, which is building the color up over multiple, maybe 25 layers of color, and you're slowly increasing the brightness. But if you're wet blending, right, with acrylic paint especially, you're probably going to need something like that to mix into the paint to keep it from drying. And I should say, in the past, puts back on camera, if you're using acrylic paint and you're in like like Australia, right, in a spot, or you're using like overhead lights that are really hot, I mean, there's some reasons to maybe use something like that. But flow improver,
just because the drying time's short.
yeah, I mean, I should have grabbed my pot, but like Lamy and Medium, which is a product that GW sells, that's essentially like a flow improver, right? Like it's
yeah. So the full speed paints range and Army Painter, they have something similar. I haven't got it right next to me at the same time, but basically, yeah, some sort of
it thins it out.
They call
right?
it a thinning medium. Yeah,
and it's like a flow improver, right? And so.
And so one thing I've found recently is even with reasonable care for the brushes, things like speed paint seem to be much, much harsher on the brushes. Do you find that different paints are more or less harsh on your brushes?
I mean, it really comes down to how you're applying the paint, how rough you are against the surface, right? And then also, if you don't take care of your brush, for example, you want to keep, especially with acrylic paints, you want to keep the brush wet the whole time, right? And you don't want to put paint in the ferrule, right? The ferrule is the metal part at the end of the paint handle, right?
Yep.
That connects the brushes, that connects the bristles to the handle. So what I have found is I am typically using paint that's thin enough that as long as and we'll talk about how I, how often I clean a brush and stuff, but like if I am actively mindful of that, I mean, most of my Calypsy Scables will last a couple of years, right? Now, this 8404 that is now a brush brush, I've had it about a year and it's painted a couple armies and it's seen better days, right? So it also depends on how often you use the brush, right?
Yeah, so my experience might be that not so much that the paint's harsher, but maybe because it's contrast and I slap it on a bit more, maybe it's actually the paint
washes
style
are a good
harsher.
example of where you can really, like that brush I was showing you before, you might not be able to pick this up. But you can see that I really am haphazard with the application. I'm just back up. Maybe get to, but I don't know if you can tell, but there's a lot of wash buildup around the ferrule.
Yes, right. Yep.
Like,
yep.
And then so the brush is kind of shot. And if I was more careful, I wouldn't allow the wash to get up in the ferrule like that. But this is an older brush, and that's what it's for.
It's a good motto for life, isn't it? Always clean your tip.
Well, and you look at this brush, right? This is a Series 7 number 3. This is like 5 years old. Now I pretty much only use this for eyeballs. But like,
so you use quite a large brush for eyeballs.
Yeah.
But just by looking after it and keeping the tip.
Yep. Keep the point on it. And the fact that I'm not using it for general base coating and stuff. And that's a good tip too. Like if you do have high quality brushes, you don't necessarily need to use them for base coating. You could just wait, get the base coats on, maybe apply a wash, and then you could then you kick in with some better brushes to apply the layers.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly probably where I've drifted towards, given that, I've gone more towards the, getting it done side with washes with a bit of layering over, like highlighting over the top. And so for the workhorses, I've moved towards quite cheap brushes, and then layer with something better.
And we can certainly talk about that as well, right? That
Mm,
there are like, I don't want to call them craft store brushes, but they're like school brushes, like the kind you
mm,
give a kid in art class, right? And those are totally functional if you're like painting terrain or you're dry brushing, and then we should probably touch on this, just the idea between like a synthetic versus a natural fiber or natural hair, right? So
yep.
I mean, synthetic, historically, a cheap synthetic brush, not one of these, but a cheap one, what's going to happen is that the tip is you're going to lose your point quick, and the point and the tip is going to kind of curl over into like a hook. That just because it doesn't bounce back as good as real hair, right? Um, However, I say that this brush that I picked up, I don't know, a few months ago, like it's got a pretty nice tip, and it's actually
Mm,
surprising me how, and this is synthetic, how good it's maintaining that point. But I'm treating it like and just for comparison, this number 3 might be $35, right? This is number 3. This is number 2 synthetic. This is like $12, right?
and what brand's that synthetic? Sorry, is that the
Yeah,
Escada?
it's Escada. Yeah, it's from Spain. You could
Yeah.
also get synthetics. Like a popular one, like is like a golden Taclon, which is really describing the type of fiber that's being used. It's like a gold color, very
Yeah.
popular. But there's I've been showing Kolinsky sables, but you can also get like camel hair and all kinds of other things,
Yeah. Yeah.
which
And
will not hold a point as well, but will be just fine for flooding the area with washes or dry brushing.
yeah, and obviously in general, your synthetics will be cheaper because there's no hair collection
Well,
required,
yeah,
right?
and
It's
I would
like
say,
badger hair. I imagine all these badgers walking around with just tufts of fur missing.
yeah, I mean, the Kolinsky sable, which is a sable, right? But it's a
Mm,
specific kind. The problem is like they have to harvest that in a respectful way, and it's hard to get. It's hard to import. They're going to be the most expensive, but there's other ones that are like synthetic sable or some other mix where they take some sable and maybe mix in some other types of hair. So
mm,
what I always tell people is just try it. I
mm.
mean, maybe we should answer this question. Well, why would you want to buy a good brush? Well, if you take care of it, it's like makes my job a lot easier. Control is a lot better. It has a good, it's just easier to paint with, right?
Yeah, I
But
think you really notice the difference with a quality brush, don't you? Particularly with a really good tip. The control on how the paint goes on is second to none.
exactly.
Mm,
Yeah, so we'll put links in this video to a bunch of different brushes. I mentioned the Raphael 8404, one of these guys. This is what Jeremy and I have kind of switched away from Winsor Newton to this because it's about $10 less a brush. So this is like
mm,
$30. You're talking low 20s, and these are actually easier to get, right?
yeah.
Um, and then synthetics, you can do a high end synthetic like this one from Escoda, or you
Mhm,
can buy. There's a company called Princeton Art was it Princeton Brush and Art Supply, and they're available all over like Dick Blick, which is an online store, or most of your hobby shops, and they've got the wide range of like what I would call they're not bottom barrel, they're not Chinese brushes. Like
mm,
if you're really wanting to go cheap, I mean you can go on Temu or one of those places and buy like the brushes are like 10 cents a piece. They're garbage, but there may be some applications where that makes sense because you're dry brushing and you literally can just throw the brush away when you're done.
mm.
But the next step up, that like a company like Princeton Brush and Art Company, they've got a lot of natural fibers like hog hair and camel hair, which they won't give you the point that a Kolinsky sable has, but maybe you don't need the point if you're applying washes. And they have a wide range of synthetic brushes, which
Yeah.
a lot of times what we're talking about is you're looking for brushes made for watercolor. I know it sounds crazy, but that's really what you're looking for, is a watercolor brush, because that's the style of brush that is, watercolor is the closest traditional painting method to what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess the main other tool besides the brushes is your palettes. And over the years we've heard you're a big fan of the wet palette, aren't you?
Yeah. So Let me see if I can get this open.
That's your exemplar.
Yeah, so this is the exemplar wet palette. I have they make it in like multiple sizes. Let me just open it up so you can see what a wet palette looks like. So hopefully you guys can see this. But so this is a wet palette that's all ready to go. The palette is actually wet. You can see the paper is ready to go. There's a sponge and there's a piece of parchment paper, not wax paper. You can make wet palettes at home if you just take like baking paper or parchment paper.
Yep.
But don't use wax paper because that defeats the purpose, right? It makes the water roll off. And you just put a sponge. So you can basically take like a piece of Tupperware, a Tupperware container, put a sponge, or a lot of times, like if you're in a real pinch, you can just stack up some wet paper towel and then put a piece of parchment over the top. Oh, it's already dripping on me. You can see that. See it?
Yeah.
And then this one's got
weights
in the corner, which help keep the, as the paper dries out, if you don't continue to add water, it'll kind of roll up on you. And the palette weights are copper, so it's supposedly like reduces microbial contamination, but also keeps the paper in place. But what's cool about this is not just a wet palette. So in the lid, right, they've got the ability to add dry palettes, basically. So this is the silicone version, but they also make one that's a hard plastic. And I would say 90% of the time I'm using a wet palette. However, if I'm applying a ton of washes, this makes a lot of sense to use one of these weld palettes, right? And you can just put the wash in there and remove it. If you're dry brushing, I'll probably use this thing in the middle, right? And that's where I'll put the paint and I'll put paint on. And because ultimately a dry brush, you're trying to get water and paint out to be dry, right? If you're using a wet palette, it kind of defeats the purpose because it's making the paint a lot moisture. And this is probably where we should talk about a dry brush palette, right? So something like this, which is a piece of MDF where it's it's got like some kind of dumb design, but basically after you take your paint from the dry palette, right? You apply to the brush. I'll take a paper towel and get most of the excess away. And then I'll get the brush to the right level that I want by dry brushing the texture on this palette. And at that point, then I'll move over and actually paint the model. And these are disposable. I don't know. They're a few bucks. And then, you fill it up and then eventually you can just chuck it. The MDF helps to pull the moisture out, right? And pull paint off the brush, but also the texture will help you do the same thing. And in fact, what's nice about these is if you want to practice dry brushing, you could use something like that. And in fact, there's companies now that make 3D printed texture palettes or texture plates where
so basically it helps rub it off.
Or you want to practice, you could just paint it and then you can just throw it in a bucket, strip the paint off and start again, right? So
and so then other options for wet palettes are I've got my
the Cry-Dufy. So I use that for like out in the garage, like with terrain, because it's that is a wet palette with like a big giant
so it's kind of, and it's got removable sections, so like water wells, things like that, and then it's got the actual palette underneath clips on and off, so you can see that there. You can store your excess paper on top, and then just like the bit different to the exemplar, that it's just got two little clips, and this is good for me because it's more mobile. That's still got paint in it, but it's there's lots of options out there, but certainly my two favorites are those Redgrass, because exemplars.
I have a Redgrass gaming palette as well.
Oh no, exemplar's different, isn't it? What's the company?
Well, the difference is Redgrass has like a lid that you snap down, like you.
That's right.
Use like a rubber. It's almost like a gasket. It kind of forms around the edge. Whereas exemplar literally has a rubber gasket, and then you clip it down, lock it in place. Yeah. So
I think the exemplar and the Cry-Dufy certainly are my favorites.
And in terms of dry palettes too, like I showed you this, right? But they make them out of plastic. But if you go to any art shop, you can get like a watercolor palette, which is like usually guys like 7 or 8 welds. I like the ones that are made out of ceramic because they're easier to clean, and you could use that. You could also get like aluminum ones, right? I know for using oil paints, I like, I'm not gonna. For oil paints, I'm not using a wet palette, right? Like it doesn't make any sense. I'm gonna put it on a dry palette and add mineral spirits to thin the paint. So the cool thing is, like, you don't have to buy miniature or gaming specific materials. You can just go buy art stuff for the most part. Because I mean, Winsor Newton is not making this for us; they're making it for watercolor, right?
Yeah.
And we just happen to know that it works for what we're doing as well. Other companies, Rosemary and Company from the UK is also a great Kolinsky Sable brush maker that is actually relatively cheap. You know, even cheaper than the Raphael, but harder to get. Some companies, you know, it depends on where you are. I don't know, Matt. You in the US, it's hard to get because they have like import restrictions on Kolinsky Sable, so sometimes it's harder to get. So,
yeah, I think certainly in Australia, the Kolinsky Sable are kind of more available at craft stores. Like there's a chain, Eckersley's and things like that. So they're not terribly hard, but they might be difficult in the size that you want. But they are very expensive.
And it'd probably be good to talk about that since we're mostly going to be using a round. If you're just starting, buy a number 2. That's going to be your workhorse brush. Maybe buy a 1 and a 0, and that's really all you need, right? Like that's it. You can, you know, when I was like mid 90s, I'm learning to paint. Like, oh, get a 0.00. That's worthless. It doesn't hold any paint. It's like a couple strands. So I have some, but so situational. And like I said, a number 3 or even a number 4 with a good point is going to do things like eyeballs because it's not about the size of the brush. It's about the tip, as you said earlier, Matt.
Yeah. And you'd find if you did use something like the 000, because it doesn't hold paint, you try and get more paint and then it forms a ball on the end and then you end up buggering it up anyway. So
exactly.
Yeah. So I think to summarize the paintbrush section of this is that, you know, for most of your models, you're going to want something with a round tip. A size 2 will be your workhorse. You've got different options in terms of your, you know, real type hairs like your Sables, which you've got your Raphaels, your Winsor and Newtons, your Rosemary and Co's as good options. You can choose to use synthetic if you want a bit cheaper. Rob, you're using a Skoda for that one. And then
you could go to I'm sure you have hobby stores too, like a Michael's or a Hobby Lobby, right? Like a traditional hobby store that sells paint art supplies. You go there, they have a ton of synthetic brushes available, and they're like $7-8. Try one if you like it.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah, and then for dry brushing, you've got your more makeup style rounded tip and your flat brush, and probably for those, you know, you certainly don't need to be spending a fortune to get something that works. Whoop, you're on mute.
So like for dry brushing terrain and stuff or bases, this is what I like. I have a lot of control. It's a big surface area. It holds a lot of paint, and this is like a number 10 or something. This is like 95 cents or maybe a couple bucks at the most, right? And you can usually buy a value pack, right, where it's got like a bunch. This is a more modern advancement, which is the makeup style brush. You can literally buy makeup style brushes if you want, right? Because they're not that expensive. Or you can go this route, which is this is a Monument Hobby, but Army Painter or whatever. The trick about these brushes, try them out. The Army Painter brush, man, the hairs just come out, and nothing ruins my day than dry brushing and then leaving behind a bunch of bristles. This one has not shown to do that. Or the Artist Opus ones also don't do that.
Is that a Monument Hobbies one?
This is a Monument Hobbies, yeah. So I don't know if you'll be able to see that or not, but this is a Monument Hobby. I think it's called DD3, and then like I guess that stands for dry brush or something. And then they have 2, 1, they have different sizes. And I should mention, when you're using a flat, you can also get ones that have an angle, right? Just so that, you know, look at what you're trying to dry brush and find the right brush that'll get you in where you want to go. But if you're edge highlighting, right, you're still gonna, or layering or washing or whatever else, just the round is what you're gonna use.
Yeah. Okay. And then probably what we should go into is the cleaning of the stuff, which is the important bit, because How to Keep Your Tip Clean by Rob Phaneuf, you know.
That's right.
So it's one thing would be is how do you keep it clean as you're painting? Because as you mentioned, you can be painting and it can be, and if you're in a drier climate or something like that, it'll be drying as you're using it, right?
Yeah.
So you can, even if you're using a wet palette, you're going back to that. But if you're not getting all the paint off the brush as you're painting, there'll be some in the deeper fibers, and it can actually be going to work.
Well, we call it the belly of the brush, right? The belly will have more paint will be deposited. So just in general, you want to keep the brush wet. And if you're using a wet palette, that helps. But, you know, if I'm painting, let's say for a couple hours, every like somewhere between 10 or 20 minutes, you know, I'm going to go ahead and rinse. I'm not going to soap it up or anything. I'm just going to rinse it out. I'm going to rinse all the paint out, and I'm going to put it on paper towel, and I'm going to clean the brush with just water. Right. And I'm going to do that often so that the bristles are staying wet and you're not letting stuff build up into the ferrule. And so that's the first thing. You also, if you're changing colors, that's a great time to go ahead or if you're taking a break, rinse your brush out 100%. But at the end of a paint session, or if you have a really long paint session, maybe an hour in, you might stop and actually clean your brush. And, you know, cleaning your brush starts like what I just said, which is you rinse the paint out, right? You go in and you just take clean water and you over and over try to get as much of the paint out. But then eventually you're going to want to use an actual brush soap, and this is one of them. This is the traditional art one. This is the Masters what's it called? The Masters brush cleaner and preserver, right? And so what you'll do with this is after your brush is relatively clean, you'll get your tip wet and you'll just lather it up. And you know, it's important when you're lathering or when you're removing water and paint from the brush that you're not smashing the bristles, right? You do it in a nice, clean, orderly way. Don't twist it. I've seen people go like this. You know, they're actually turning the brush. That actually is going to kind of spiral your now, just a straight stroke and then rotate the brush, straight stroke, rotate the brush, right? And what's nice about a product like this is also like a conditioner or a preserver. So it's going to add, it's going to clean the brush, right? But it's also going to add nutrients back into, especially if you're using a sable hair, it's going to add stuff back into the brush to make it springy again. And what you can do is if you forget to dry, you forget to clean your brush, and all of a sudden you're like, oh crap, you can use this stuff by lathering it up, let it set, let it harden, and then clean it off, and it'll actually help to help pull paint out of the ferrule, and that kind of thing. And I'll clean my brushes with this at the end of every paint session. Maybe a couple times a year, you might go and really lather up all your brushes and sort of condition them. And then there's another product. So this is just like all-purpose cleaning, right, of a brush. But then there's another product that I'll use. Well, let's touch on, if you're using oil paints, you got to use mineral spirits because water is not going to cut it, right? It's not going to get the oil out. So you're using mineral spirits, which will absolutely strip all the great stuff that's on your brush. So after you use something like this,
you got to condition it.
Yeah, and you could use something like this, but there's another product that's really great is Winsor & Newton brush cleaner and restorer, right? This stuff is amazing. Now it will really clean it's sort of like really scrubbing that, you know, you're really getting the brush and the bristles down to square one. And so this is a great product to use occasionally, right? Or as a great segue to a great partner to this. And you know, the trick about brushes is you kind of know when you need to do something. Like if you grab your brush and it's not springy, right? If it's not springy or it doesn't have a point, which we'll talk about how you point your brush. But if it doesn't feel like it has the snap, well, then it's probably time to add some nutrients back to this. And you know, this is one way. Another thing that or this will also do it. The other thing I'll mention, I'll do this like a couple times a year. You can get a rack that will, and I should grab mine, but basically it's a rack that holds a brush like this. And you can suspend the bristles and the bottom of the ferrule into a solution like this, and you can leave it for a couple days. And what happens is if there's anything up in the ferrule or near the base of the bristles near the ferrule, it'll fall out and it'll drop to the bottom of the cup, right? And so you can really do a deep clean with that as well. So,
and what about mineral spirits versus something like turpentine? If you
I mean, you can use if you're using artist grade oil paint, use mineral spirits. Turpentine's like a step too far. It'll like, you know, and to be fair with this stuff, this is what you would use to clean your dry palette. If you got oil paint on it, you can let it dry. This stuff will get anything off, including the paint on your handles. So be careful. Same
if people are wondering, and if people are wondering what the difference is between those, mineral spirits is, you know, derived from petroleum, whereas turpentine's from a pine tree resin. So, but it's a pretty harsh stuff.
It's
you know?
very harsh. And I should mention too, this stuff you should really be using in a nice. I do the stuff out in the garage, right?
Yeah.
Use it in a ventilated area because now this one's odorless, and I think this one's got like reduced vapor or something, so it's not quite as bad. But like if you buy like the industrial stuff from a DIY store, it will knock you on your butt. So please be careful with that. But let's just talk about, how do you clean your brush at the end, right? So we talked a little bit about it. Number one, keep your brush wet. That's the first thing. Keep it wet. Use a wet palette if possible, or even just keep rinsing it out, right? And then when you're done painting, rinse out the brush several times to get as much paint off the bristles as you can. Then lather it up in this type of soap, right? And make sure you're not twisting or bending the bristles. Rinse the soap out, go and swish it into a cup. And, paint cup, I don't have one here, but just a big coffee mug is what you need.
Yeah.
Game Envy, the people that make the exemplar wet palette, they have one. You could buy one if you want. Games Workshop makes one. They're fine.
Yeah.
But do not, under any circumstances, put your brush in the pot and let it sit there, because you're going to ruin the brush, because it's gonna basically smash your bristles against the bottom. So lather it up, swish it around, pull it across the paper. Keep doing that until you don't see soap or paint or any kind of color. And then you got to point your brush, and you could just, while it's wet, you could just roll your fingers in it, or a lot of people will just use their mouth to point the brush. And
which if all your stuff's off it, is totally safe, so shouldn't be worried.
Well, even if it's not, like this stuff is not going to, none of the stuff's going to kill you. Like this stuff right on the bottles is non-hazardous, right? It's not going to hurt you. Now I'm not doing it with mineral spirits, right? Like I don't do it. And I should say, this is an important thing we didn't touch on, but different tools for different methods. And so I have a different set of brushes that I use for oil paints, and I don't mix and match. The other thing, this is going to sound crazy, because one of the things people ask me, like, how has things changed over the years? Well, nothing worse than screwing up a paint job because you didn't think it through. And this is one that, it's going to sound crazy, but it's not crazy. Metallics are very hard on your brushes. And so typically I am going to, once a brush, like this is getting close to the point where it's a little raggedy, I will make it a metallic brush. I do not use metallics on all, like I have a set of brushes for metallics. And I also have a different soap block, and I have a different water pot. And why? Well, metallics, unsurprisingly, have little metal flakes. And if you use your brush that you just painted, like if you took this brush and you painted, say, silver, and you cleaned it out, you might not get all the metallic flake out. And now you're switching to red, and you get the brush loaded with red. And what will ruin your day is you got that nice smooth base coat on, or a layer, and here are a couple silver spots where there's some metallic flake. So really, first of all, I don't paint a lot of metallic. I've really switched to more airbrushing metallics. But if you're going to use metallics, just get yourself a couple different brushes, put them off to the side, and just sort of treat them separately, kind of keep them separated, as the the offspring would say. And that helps. Keep it separated. And then, Matt, how do you? I'm curious, because I've seen how you handle your brushes. How do you store your brushes?
So ideally, certainly if I'm taking care of them. So, like you said, never down. Because that's just you're going to end up with a bent brush. It's going to be ruined.
You're going to ruin
the
brush. Yeah.
So horizontally, I don't have so generally they'll be in a container, so that's probably still going to damage them. I imagine that something like a rack is better.
Yeah, I've got some over here. Let me grab those.
Yeah.
Should have grabbed this before, so we had it. All right, so at the very least, just get yourself a cup and put them in a cup. But like this is called like a pipette tray, which is but it doesn't really matter. What's nice about this is that the brushes aren't even banging into each other, right? And you can see what's that say on there?
Metal.
These are all my metal brushes. These are like garbage
Mm.
brushes. I wouldn't. And you know what? You do sometimes have to dry brush metallics. So I have like these are the brushes that have gone to die, right? So that's one option, and this is a good option just sitting on your table. A lot of paint racks that you buy, like maybe in a couple of weeks we'll go back and we'll do the same conversation from my paint station, and we can show you all the equipment that I have on there.
Yeah.
And those paint stations have holes for brushes as well. If you want to travel with your brushes, this is an option from Game Envy. And let me grab one and put it in here and show you how it works. You would just slide it in here, right, like this, right? And what's cool about this is when you get to your location, you pull the handle and it makes a thing and it holds the brush like that, right? But so that's an option. But this is probably my favorite. If you're traveling with brushes, this is from Monument Hobbies. And yeah, so like these are like, I've got $200 sitting here in brushes, like, don't want them to get all beat up. And so something like this, where you really can't tell from what I'm showing you, but the brushes, the bristles themselves are not touching anything.
No.
Like
so the point is there's no contact, so they can't get bent or
on any surface. Yeah. Now you can see, like, if you look at this Artist Opus brush, like I haven't used it, but you can see it's dried out, and so the tip is like I would have to repoint it before I used it, but it's not damaged. It's just dry. Right?
Just dry.
Yeah. So this is what I've been using, like if I'm going to the game store or something, because I trust that the bristles aren't going to get damaged. But locally at home, just get a cup or a pipette tray, or they do make racks like this. Grabbed it off my daughter's paint station, like this, right? So you take your brush and you put it on like that. It'll hold it. This is not convenient for me.
Yeah.
Now if I'm actively using the brush, I like Game Envy. They make a little. I have one. Oh, do I have one on the table? I don't have one. They make a little rubber silicone thing that sits on the table, and it has some grooves, and it just keeps the brush from rolling around. It raises the tip up, the end of the brush up a little bit. So it's my active brush, and it keeps it from rolling off the table or getting damaged while I'm using it.
Yeah. And I think for those of you that enjoy 3D printing, there'd be heaps of options.
Oh, there's so many options.
So many options.
Yeah.
You can basically just and like no need to print in resin, right? You just print in your PLA.
No, cheaper the better, right? But I have to say, like, some of these options are so cheap. Like,
yeah, why would you bother?
I mean, a glass jar is not expensive. Now, when you put them in a cup, the risk is that you might you could potentially bang the bristles together, I guess. Whereas something like this keeps them separate.
Yeah, you could cut any old foam though
100%.
to just put in tight side top of a jar or something, and then just poke holes in it so that none of them touch each other.
And I should mention, like, it doesn't really matter for these kind of brushes, right? It's really your like expensive brushes that you're doing a lot of the higher, like, you need a good point. So these are the brushes that you care about. If you got dry brushes, or you have brushes that are used for terrain or basing, it's like whatever. And I didn't show it, but like bigger projects, this brush is not going to cut it, right? You're probably going to have one that's a 2 or 3 inch wide brush, like a really big. And for pallets, I'm talking about like a paper plate or a piece of aluminum foil at that point, right? So we'll have to do this again, Matt, at the paint
from
station.
Your station. Yeah.
All
right, thanks, mate. We really appreciate it. I'm sure the crowd will enjoy those lessons from the Hobby Master. So if you enjoyed that, I guess I should do the obligatory like and subscribe, shouldn't I, Rob? So like and subscribe. Drop us a comment below in the comment section. Maybe give us an idea of what else you'd like to see on video if you're actually watching on video, because we haven't done a lot of video stuff before. And hopefully you enjoyed it. And so until next time, keep countercharging.